which I'm pleased to introduce. So my name is Pierre Ghislain. I'm the Africa Development Bank's Vice President for Private Sector, Infrastructure, and Industrialization. I'll just give you in a few words the way this panel will, this session will unfold. We will start with introductory remarks by Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD. So that will be an opening remarks followed by a presentation by the African Development Bank and the Boston Consulting Group of a report that we've done together on industrialization in Africa and on the opportunities that offer. And then we will follow with a panel discussion, and I will introduce the panelists when we get to that point. But maybe first a few points from myself. As you probably know by now, is the African Development Bank has five top priorities, high fives we call them, and industrialize Africa is one of them. It's not necessarily the one we talk most about, but it is an important one. It's one of our top priorities. When it comes to implementing that agenda, it's a challenging agenda. It's, as for most other agendas, it's one that we cannot play out, where we cannot roll out policies and approaches in the same way in the 54 African countries. Different contexts, different realities require different approaches. So in terms of our overall priorities, and again, you'll hear more of that during the panel, one of the areas where we see tremendous opportunity for Africa is in the interface between investment and trade. And the Continental Free Trade Area that was adopted at the Heads of States meeting of the AU in Kigali last March provides a tremendous opportunity not just for increased trade, but also for increased investment and for accelerated industrialization. And I hope that we'll be able to address that as part of this panel. So that's clearly one angle that I'm personally particularly interested in, is how we can create the energy of a more integrated Africa to increase opportunity for industrial investment on the continent. The second one, which is related, and I'm not summarizing our strategy, which has 5 work streams, etc., but I won't get into all those details. The second area that I'm particularly keen on emphasizing and developing is linked to the first one, is how can we as African Development Bank, but also we as development player, and you've seen the Africa Investment Forum, how we've come together with the other African regional and development finance institutions, how can we in particular support African investors in their investments outside of their home base? And not that we won't support them in their home base, we do, and we will continue to do so. But for us, the opportunity to help investors expand markets and go outside of their home base is a strategic priority. We see it as one of the enablers of real regional integration, one of the catalysts for the true effective implementation of a single continental free trade area. Indeed, like in many other areas of public policy, private sector is, can be, and must be a major driver of change. Private sector is what can make these big programs like the Continental Free Trade Area a reality. Private sector investors are those who can tell policymakers, regulators, and other stakeholders what isn't working, what is holding them back, what they would need in terms of support or reduction in barriers or hassles to expand their investments, to go abroad and industrialize Africa. Enough from me. I'd like now to ask our 2 presenters to, first I'd like to ask Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki to give us some introductory remarks, upon which we will then hear from BCG and our Director for Industrial and Trade Development on our report on industrialization in Africa. Dr. Mayaki, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Gislen. And very quickly, let me congratulate the African Development Bank for organizing this forum. As a representative of the African Union heading the NEPAD agency, which is the development agency of the African Union, we consider this space as critical in terms of thinking about private sector involvement in our development strategy. So I will have 5 quick points and try to stay. I still have 7 minutes 34. Okay. My first point is that the main obstacle to Africa's development, we don't repeat it enough, is fragmentation. 55 countries can't have 55 industrial strategies. So when we see our countries defining 2020 strategies, 2030 strategies, it's not an optimal solution. They first need to think regionally and then plan nationally according to the regional thinking. Because the optimality of the solutions to most of our problems, from energy to transport to education, the optimal solution is not national, it's regional. And in industrialization, it will be the same. Point number 2, the continental free trade area is a very important framework, but we should think about the learning curve that we'll have to go through in our regional markets. Learning curve of competitiveness will be through the regional markets. So regional markets are extremely important in order to implement the continental free trade area. Point number 3, when we talk about regional markets, there is an issue of geography that we need to take into account, which is the corridors. 20, 30 years from today, we will not talk about the Malawis, the Niger, my country, the Mozambique, will refer to corridors. Because corridors will have an economic density that will boost intra-Africa trade, and it will allow a different type of integration. So corridors will be very important. Point number 4, let us not forget about agriculture. It's true that we have a high rate of urbanization, but still, by 2050, 50% of our population will still be in rural areas. And take very quickly the example of a country like Mali, 20 million inhabitants, 70% of our population in rural areas, living fundamentally out of agriculture, demographic growth rate of 3.2, which means coming on the employment market, you have 200 to 300,000 cohorts of young looking for a job. They can't be hired by the public service. You have an incipient industry, so you need to build on agricultural transformation in order to move towards industrialization. Now, last point, I think in the high 5, the industrialization point is very important, but we need also to have, and there is a coherence with African Union framework, which is the AIDA, the Accelerated Industrialization Development Agenda, which fundamentally focuses on how to boost small and medium enterprises. I don't think we'll reinvent the wheel. You look at Germany, you look at Japan, 90% of the firms are small and medium, and Africa will go the same way. So there is an issue which is very important of human capital. Physical capital, we know how to do it, how to do the roads, how to do the ports, and so on. But technical solutions are known. Natural capital will need agricultural transformation and a better land management. In terms of social capital, the institutions are moving quite well, governance is improving, but the human capital will be the critical dimension for our industrialization. And if you look at our demographic composition, you clearly see that the numbers are massive. We need to create 400 million jobs for 400 million Africans who are already born and are with us between now and 2030. So these massive numbers need massive responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayaki. So now we'll ask the two presenters of this report on industrialization to come to the podium, and it's Abdul Mukhtar, who is Director, Industrial and Trade Development at the African Development Bank, and Patrick Dupoux, Senior Partner and Managing Director at BCG. Abdul, you have the floor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? So this is a time when you need to wake up. For those of you who have been sleeping for the last 1 hour. I want to start by basically reminding you, and Pierre talked about this, the priorities for the African Development Bank. 5 key priorities that we have in the last couple of years. So today we are focusing mostly on industrialize Africa and integrate Africa of the 5 high fives. But I just want to stress the point that these high fives are like the 5 fingers of a hand. So they are really integrated, and you cannot really separate one from each other. Now, focus on the industrialize Africa and the integrate Africa. At the heart of this is our African champions, and that's the theme of today's discussion. We need these champions to produce the goods, to do the trading that we're talking about, and to provide the jobs that we're all talking about. Now, I want to start by just also some depressing news. If you look at the graphs up there, you see that Africa really remains relatively under-industrialized. When you look at the share of industry in terms of jobs produced on the continent, and in terms of manufactured goods that are exported out of the continent, you look at it, the orange bars, it shows that just less than 6% of jobs that are created on the continent are actually from industry, compared to many other regions of the world. And when you look at imports, it shows that we import about 66%, 2/3 of all the imports that we do into the continent are from manufactured goods. So we basically are importing manufactured goods. We are not exporting manufactured goods. So the narrative really has to change at some point. And if you look at it, also, this is also another piece of not so good news in terms of overall growth in GDP and in terms of jobs created. Again, when you look at industry as a percentage of the whole, while the GDP over the last 10 years on the continent has grown by over 5%, average of 5%, in industry it's only 3%. And when you look at it in terms of jobs created, annual employment growth, again, over the last 10 years, total about 3%, in industry only 2%. So we need to do more in the industrial area. It just shows that we are really far behind in industrialization. So what do we need to do to really industrialize? I mean, we talk about all of these issues, but I think that 3 key things need to happen, and we've spent a lot of the last 2 days talking about many of these things. One, we need to improve our investment climate. It's very, very critical that governments and public sector and everybody works on accelerating policy and regulatory reforms. There is some good news, though. Last year, in the Ease of Doing Business report, over 30 out of 48 countries in Africa have actually undertaken at least one major reform. So this is a piece of good news. And we heard from the presidents this morning that they are very committed to doing this. We need to see more of this in order to accelerate, to improve the investment climate and accelerate industrialization. Second, we need to open up markets through regional integration. Regional integration is a big theme, and Mayaki has talked about it. We're going to talk about it. My colleague, Patrick, is going to talk about it. But some of the regional agreements, continental free and regional trade agreements, must be implemented to improve and expand markets and attract more investments. If you look at intra-Africa trade, it's the lowest in Africa, even though there has been some increase over the last 4 years, from 2012, from 13% to almost 17% currently. But when you look at it in terms of what is happening elsewhere, Africa is still really at the low end of the scale in terms of intra-African trade. We're at 17%, EU is almost 70%, the North America 50%, and so on. So we need to do more of that regional integration, and we're going to talk about what we need to do specifically in that area. Finally, we need to support intra-African investment. And I think that's why we're here. That's why we have these great investors and champions on the table. We need to invest in our own country. We need to drive and support African champions so that they can expand and do stuff. If you look at FDI, is about 16.8% of total FDI to Africa is only through intra-African investment. So we need to do more of that as well. Now, we've done a report which we have launched recently at the Africa Development Bank. It's called the Africa to Africa Investment Report, which we just launched, and you can check it out on our website. We'll also have hard copies of the report tomorrow, so you'll be able to pick it up. But basically, we identified companies across the continent that are really doing investment within the continent, and we highlighted some of those companies. Look at what the key success factors are, what they are doing right and what they are doing wrong. So up on the slide, you see just 4 companies that we're highlighting. Many of them are familiar names. Dangote Group, the CEO was here with us this morning. He talked about what he's doing, expansion into about 13 African countries, employing over 24,000 people in Africa. OCP, a major fertilizer company in Morocco, with 15 subsidiaries, has just signed a almost $4 billion deal to do major projects in Ethiopia and is expanding also aggressively across the continent. You have Ethiopian Airlines that is, partnering with other national airlines, national carriers like Zambia Air and Chitad Air, and acquiring, major stakes. You have also multinational companies, and Patrick will talk more about this, who are also doing more things. So Unilever, for example, is investing almost €500 million to expand its manufacturing facilities across Africa. I'm proud to say that 3 of these companies that we are highlighting are clients of the bank, so we're happy to work with them, and we're happy to work with more and new companies to also get them to that stage where they can also expand beyond their borders. What the ADB is doing. So we look at all the things that people say and distill basically say, what are the barriers to industrialization? We said, look, there are 5 key issues: policy, legislation, institutions, lack of them, lack of conducive environment and infrastructure, lack of access to capital, access to markets, competitive talents, capabilities and entrepreneurship. I think that's what Mayaki was talking about when he was talking about human capital as one of the key issues to look at. And we say, how do we design programs in the bank that will address each of these barriers systematically? And we came up with about 6 solutions, which we call flagship programs for the bank. So specific challenge targeted in a specific way. So for example, the issue with policy, we have a whole program in the bank to foster successful industrial policies across member countries. We are doing this in partnership with other organizations like UNIDO. We are doing pilot programs in 3 countries right now as we speak: Morocco, Ethiopia, and Senegal, and we're going to roll out this more. So we are addressing that specifically. When it talk about access to markets, for example, one of the key things that we're focusing on is to create efficient industry clusters and so on and so forth. So what did we do with BCG, Boston Consulting Group? We partnered with them end of last year to basically say, what are the priority areas? What can we do? Which areas shall we focus on? When we talk about industrialization, there are so many things that you can do, especially when we work with the private sector. They are into so many things. And say, how do we prioritize this so that we can focus? We cannot do everything. So what I have here is a result of what we came up with as the sectors that the ADB is really focusing on in terms of industrialization. You'll notice here that agro-processing is not written, but because agro-processing is handled separately within the bank's architecture, but does not mean that it's not important. So we came up with these 15 addressable sectors, which we tiered into 3, basically based on how important and how aggressively we're going out and looking for deals in those sectors. Tier 1 areas like ICT, building materials, hospitality, fertilizers, and transport and logistics. You see us being very active in these areas, making deals with partners and companies in this respect. And then in a similar fashion, we have Tier 2 and Tier 3. So this is what we've done, and we spent a lot of time. This can be debated, whether these are the real sectors that we should focus on, but a lot of thinking and a lot of analysis has gone into this. We did a lot of we look at a number of criteria through which we filtered that are really relevant to what it means for development. So this is what we did with BCG, and the result of this is we identified at least almost 1,900 potential businesses and companies operating in these sectors across the continent. And we are now talking to these companies aggressively in the case of tier 1 and opportunistically in the case of the other tiers to see what deals, what companies we can work with, we can support, we can finance so that we can move them from where they are to become also regional champions. Now, I'm not leaving you with, I want to leave you with some good news. I know I depressed you about how we are deindustrialized, but I want to say that with everything that I've said, industrialization is beginning to happen. If you look at it in terms of the FDI that is coming into manufacturing, 10 years ago, about 23% of that FDI is into manufacturing. Now, it's about 30%. I think we should do more. We can do more. When the port gets bigger, the overall FDI inflow into the continent becomes bigger. Obviously, we want the manufacturing part to also grow. And we see a number of clusters already emerging in different parts of the continent. In Morocco, for example, aeronautics is taking up. The chemical industry is picking up. Ghana is positioning itself as a hub for iron and steel development. Nigeria, petrochemicals, building materials, cement and so on, as we heard from one of the big tycoons over there this morning. Things are happening. Ethiopia is becoming a hub for textile manufacturing, also fertilizer and also cement. Egypt, building materials, consumer goods, and also petrochemicals, and so on and so forth. So we see these clusters emerging, which we are working with and trying to push to make sure that industrialization happens in a very systematic manner. Without wasting much of your time, I will invite my colleague, not my colleague, but Patrick Dupont, Senior Director, BCG, in the Casablanca office, with whom we did, and his team, most of this work for the bank, to talk about integrating Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Abdul, and you did a great job. I think there are at least 3 more people now than when you started your presentation, so congratulations. So I will talk about another topic, which is the integration, one of the I5, integration of Africa. We decided actually to look at this topic of integration this year, because we think actually it's the most interesting recent trend in Africa. And we decided to look at it through the angle of the African entrepreneurs. Why is that? Because when you ask corporate entrepreneurs in Africa, what is their daily life? What is their problem? This is what they say. They say that, it's difficult to export from one Africa country to the other. You need to go through Europe, through Dubai. Logistic costs are to the roof. You have problems at the frontiers. Your staff need a visa to travel across Africa. And, the major problem is that actually Africa as a whole, seen from international investors, is interesting, but it's so fragmented that you don't get critical mass to actually make it above the radar of most of the investors. So clearly the fragmentation, the hyper-fragmentation of Africa is a roadblock to business. And if you look at it, it's a fact. Africa is way more fragmented than any other geography in the world. If we look at geography, the number of countries, the average size of countries, the average distance between large cities, and given the air connection, it took me 15 hours to come from Casablanca, and it's really difficult to travel, even if it's improving. The average flight time between the major cities is actually 12 hours in Africa, and it's only 7 in South America, East Asia, much less in Europe, much less in North America. So it's a geographic fragmentation which is way above any other continent. If you look now at the geopolitical fragmentation, again, by the number of countries, the average size of countries, the ability to actually generate critical mass anywhere in the continent, this is obviously way more fragmented than any other continent. The only exception is actually Europe. But Europe has one trade zone, one EU, hopefully still for a while Africa has 16 trade zones, some overlapping, others making it very complex for investors. And you don't need a visa to travel within Europe. You need visas to travel everywhere in Africa. 80% of Africans need a visa when they want to travel in another African country. And obviously, again, this is a major difficulty to do business. And last, the logistic fragmentation. There's been many projects to actually improve the the Trans-Africa connections, airlines, roads. But actually, if you look at all these corridors, actually, most of them do not work. The project is blocked, it hasn't moved forward. The frontier, it's a nightmare. The road doesn't exist. So the bottom line is that when you produce something in Africa, it costs you 3 times the cost of your product to move it to another and distribute it to another African country. Also the cost of the last mile distribution. So again, way more than the rest in the rest of the world. So a lot of bad news, but I'm here to say that there are also good news. And the good news is that over the last 5 to 8 years, the African integration is actually happening, starting from a low base, but it's happening. So what do you look when you look at integration? You look at how can you move capital, investment, and we see that FDIs are increasingly from Africa to another African countries, both in absolute and in relative terms. Now, close to 15% of the FDIs in Africa is coming from another African economy. You look at how you can move, also how you can acquire companies, and the most M&A and acquisitions now in Africa are done by other African corporations, foreign African corporations, more than half the deals. You look at how you move goods, and again, we are still way below where we should be, but now we are close to 20% of the export and trade is coming from within Africa. And you look at how you move people. And again, the share of Africans in travelers, in tourists, is increasing sharply and is now more than half of the total tourists in Africa. So the African integration has started to happen, and this is a great news, especially as all the other regions in the world are kind of turning their back to multilateralism. Clearly, there is an opportunity for Africans to look at their neighbors for foreign investments. So why did we write this report? So there actually are 2 reports. The reports Abdul mentioned and our report, which is on integration. Our thesis is that those who are making this integration, those who are spearheading this integration at the forefront, are corporate entrepreneurs, are the African corporations, even more than politicians. This is happening by the energy and the willingness of some African entrepreneurs and corporations. If we look at the top 30 African companies, they used to be in 8 African countries 10 years ago, and today their footprint is 15. And actually, we just updated, now it's close to 17. So this is increasing. African leading corporations are investing in Africa, expanding their footprint, and I would say even beyond their traditional comfort zone. So I see in the room, for example, Moroccan banks investing, including in English-speaking Africa. We see South African corporations investing in North Africa, in Morocco. So we see a lot of movement beyond the historical comfort zone of these investors. So I'm not going to detail this report, and obviously this is not it's not a slide where you need to read everything that is here, but this report is around and is giving credit to these African pioneers. We have highlighted 75 African companies and 75 multinational companies, because those are both African and multinational, and we see them from South Africa, from Morocco, but we also see them from UK, from France, from US, and so on, from China. And we wanted to give credit. We have a number of rankings by the number of country of presence, by the level of investments, by the ability to produce and deliver a Pan-African innovation platform, Pan-African brands, and so on. So good news, integration in Africa is happening, and a big thank you to these African corporate entrepreneurs who are making it happen actually. So again, I think we are turning to the panel. I think, again, as you see, both the industrialization of Africa and the integration are both driven by African champions, and I think the panel discussion is to talk about this and present some of these champions. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Abdul, for these presentations. And now let me turn to the panel and introduce them one by one. First, I'd like to introduce Emma Wade-Smith, who is Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Africa. Next to her is Geoffrey Kenna, who's the CEO of the Industrial Development Corporation here in South Africa. Next to him is Sarah Masmoudi, who is CEO of Teriak Laboratories in Tunisia, I believe. And next to her is Basil Elbaz, Chairman and CEO of Carbon Holdings from Egypt. So we have a rich panel here to discuss some of the ideas that we just heard about, but also to hear about their experience about championing investment and industrialization in Africa. I will start the panel by asking Emma Wade-Smith. Your role as Trade Commissioner is a new role. Theresa May has announced hugely ambitious program for Africa. Tell us about the role, tell us about the ambition, tell us about the challenges you see in achieving that ambition.
Great, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. So as you've said, the role of the Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner is a relatively new one for the UK. We have 9 trade commissioners globally, and our role really is to drive trade and investment between the UK and the rest of the world. I get the best job because I get to cover Africa and live on the African continent. And when I look at what we're trying to do, as you say, the Prime Minister has announced a strong intention to increase the amount of trade between the UK and Africa in both directions, and to shift from the UK being the second largest foreign investor in Africa, as we are currently, to being the largest G7 investor on the continent in the next few years. So that's pretty ambitious, and clearly there are challenges around that, but one of the things that I'm really heartened about, actually, is listening to that presentation and looking at the challenges, looking at the ways that we're going to change these drivers for industrialization and investment flows. I'm very encouraged that across the UK government as a whole, I think that we've got many of the tools, many of the levers, and much of the focus on the right things. To really promote that trade and investment drive. So when I think about what we are doing, we are increasing our presence here in the African continent to be able to better support that business connectivity between the UK and Africa across all the different sectors that we're seeing grow, and focusing in on those economies where we're seeing the biggest economic growth. And we're looking at that investment flow as well. So using our development finance institution, CDC, to really help to invest in those industrial champions of the future, as they have been doing for many years now, but doubling that investment over the next few years, and also doubling the amount of UK export finance, so credit, our export credit agency, the amount of finance and risk appetite that we have across Africa to support the trade flows. And we're doing things to really tackle some of these challenges. So looking at how we improve integration, how we reduce the cost, the time, and the risk of doing business across national borders through some of our programming work, particularly in East Africa, actually, of the last few years. When we look at the impact of that, we're seeing some of the costs of doing business across the East African community coming down by sort of 16–20%. The amount of time it takes to get a food permit, export or an import permit in Tanzania to move food across the border has reduced from 48 hours to 2 hours. So it is possible to have a practical effect, and we have these programs across Africa to do that. And I think then also really supporting that integration piece at a policy level. the work that we've been doing with African governments to increase capacity, to engage in discussions around trade policy, free trade agreements, economic partnership agreements, and then also now for the continental free trade area. So really building capacity and helping to provide that support that's so necessary to unlock the challenges that we see. So
trade and investment, could you tell us a bit about the nexus between the two and how the UK's intervention in this big new program or ambition, how you plan to kind of help investment support trade and help trade support investment? Could you say something about that, including which African actors you might be working with and who you see as critical stakeholders in that context?
So in my experience, I think the trade and investment picture is absolutely intertwined. And where we have UK companies that are exporting into Africa, very often actually what they are doing is investing at the same time. So building manufacturing capability and building capacity on the ground. And I think that's one of the things that I respect most about the UK business community is actually that extent of investment. Making sure that we're working with and using local talent and building local skills and really investing in local communities so that it's good business. So you have to have a return on your investment, but you also really need to invest in the communities that you're setting up in. In terms of the organizations that we're working with, I think it's really important to work with the grain of African governments programs and priorities. There's little point in us sort of trying to shoehorn something that we really want to do into a program if it's not a priority for a government. So working with the grain of that and also seeing how we can bring that expertise and the experience that we've got in the UK to bear. So if you look at PPPs, for example, in some countries, sort of a bit of a dirty word, we've got a huge amount of experience in the UK that we can offer. Not always good experience, actually. We've had our ups and downs with the PPP experience, but I think that actually makes it all the more valuable because we can, I think you learn through trying and often failing before you succeed, and so helping to short circuit some of those bear traps.
Thank you. Jeffrey Kenna, we signed a loan agreement yesterday here at the African Investment Forum, and the African Development Bank is providing a line of credit, the third we're providing to IDC. And one of the interesting features of that line of credit, half of which is in dollars, the other half of which is in rand, is that it will be used also for about half of it for IDC's work outside of South Africa. So maybe if you could tell us how IDC is supporting the African industrialization agenda, and maybe tell us a bit also on how you're really expanding and helping all African countries benefit from South Africa's experience.
Thanks, Pierre. So now that you've let the cat out of the bag that we've signed, so I hope people will not see me as being biased towards African Development Bank, which, by the way, we appreciate the collaboration because it's that collaboration that has enabled IDC to achieve what it has. I mean, we're talking about an entity that's just only about $11 billion, give or take, and of which about $1 billion of investments are outside of South Africa, as we are a development finance in South Africa. That's predominantly where we are. But the intention is to indeed increase that level of activity outside. What we've seen in the last years where there's been real growth has been on the renewable side, where our investments, give or take, are about $1 billion. So for me, that's one part which I see there's an opportunity. Firstly, as South Africa has learned from those investments, where that provides an opportunity to the rest of the African continent, not only to have those solar power plants, those wind plants, but also at the back of that to provide and support manufacturing, which is something that we've seen, so that we don't have to import those components. And the other part which we have seen where there's been growth is on the agro-processing. where we know, I think it's been said, everybody knows that in terms of arable land, Africa is indeed the continent. But what is also very obvious is that we are not processing as much as we could. So we've been supporting a lot of South African companies that have been processing. That also provides an opportunity for us into the rest of the continent. This is where the facility that we have with you also enable us to do that. But one core part which we all have to focus on when we talk about integration, when we talk about collaboration, when we talk about acceleration, is infrastructure. It comes from energy itself to the road and the rail and the airports, and that's where, as IDC, we've also played a role in terms of ensuring that we do partner, because naturally these projects by themselves are large, so we'd enter into clubs. That's where you'd want to crowd in private sector, both local and international. So that's also one part that what we've been doing very well, and hopefully from those experiences we can indeed be able to increase. But we know, I don't think anybody would doubt that the African continent is short of projects. The thing is then, how do we bring them to bankability? I know there's been lots of initiatives to ensure that we get involved in the early stage, and I'm sure, Pierre, when we negotiated the terms of the loan, you would have known that we always look at the price, because we want to go in as early as possible, help develop those projects, and ensure that indeed then we come up with bankable projects so that we can indeed ensure that they're sustainable, because those are long-term in their nature. So I think from the experience we've had, I mean, IDC being 78 years, it has helped us to be able to now to start to look into the continent, but we can only do that in partnership with a number of other entities, and African Development Bank is one of those partners that helps us, but we need more and more of those. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you give us an idea of the number of markets outside of South Africa that you are active in or planning to be active in? And also, when you lend and support investment outside of South Africa, is it typically for investors from South Africa, or are you open to any type of client in that sense?
Yeah. So we about 3.5 years ago, we changed our strategies a little bit to look at the value chains, because we thought, and I think it's been said, I mean, if you look at trade within African countries, it's not at the levels where it should be. So let's look at the value chains, let's look at which African country is good at what, and how can we indeed take advantage of this. And I think that's one thing that has worked for us. Now, when we look at the investments outside of South Africa on the agro-processing, for an example, that's one part. But we know tied to that is on the tourism side. So, I mean, that's why we have some projects in Ghana, in Uganda. On the infrastructure side, we've got projects in Senegal itself, on the port and the airport. And in Ghana, we have a project on the energy as well. And in Mali and other countries, we've got a project on agriculture. So that provides us that opportunity. But I would come back to the issue that we do these better in partnership. It's important to have an entrepreneur on the other side, be it a company, be it an individual, whom you would want to partner with. And that we've seen good stories. Some of the projects, I must say, have taken long than anyone would have. I mean, I've been at IDC for long, but I've seen some change. I mean, in the 13 years I've been the CEO, I've really seen change. When I look back and where we were and where we are now, I'm really encouraged. I mean, we've seen a number of success stories that are there, but the reality is we need to do more, because the continent is still young. The continent provides opportunities, and we all have to work together.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sarah Masmoudi, you are CEO of Teriak Laboratories. You may have seen from Abdul's presentation that in our own segmenting of the areas where the African Development Bank is focusing on, we identified pharmaceuticals in our tier 2, so in the middle, but it had a little star, which I don't think Abdul discussed. And the star was based on the following. It's that it's a market that we are exploring, that we want to understand better, because we feel that there's tremendous opportunity for investment and manufacturing on the continent. So please tell you about your company, about what you're doing in this space, and how you see the opportunities for pharmaceutical investment on the continent.
Thank you. So hi everyone, bonsoir à tous nos amis francophones. Well, I'm really delighted to be here in South Africa, and I must say that as a Tunisian, I really love the idea of moving from the northern part of Africa to the southern part of Africa. establishing a kind of virtual route across Africa. But I would have loved I could travel directly from Tunis to Johannesburg in 8 hours instead of 17 hours through some airport in Asia. So I believe if you want to industrialize Africa, by Africa, as I hear it since yesterday, we should address such issues. So I'm the CEO of a pharmaceutical Tunisian company, which belongs to a group involved in health. And we do have 2 plants in Tunisia, and we have invested in Cameroon. So I believe that's what's the interesting part of my intervention. So I believe that most successful investments are those which bring an answer to clear and really pressing needs. And I believe that in pharmaceuticals, that's the case. And I was really happy to see that on the presentation about the pharmaceutical field in general. So let me tell you a little bit about the Tunisian pharmaceutical industry. You'll understand why we had to invest. So the Tunisian pharmaceutical industry is doing quite well. In fact, we do, with 32 plants, we do cover 62% of the private sector in value, and we are really committed to reach the 70% coverage in 4 or 5 years. The point is that we are 11 million people in this country, and with not very big demographic growth. So it means that we really have to expand outside our borders. And this is crucial, and it's even a matter, I think it's even a matter of survival. So that's one thing. So since the last 5 years, we set a strategy. We were exporting to Libya, which is our comfort zone, as I heard the expert saying so. So we built a strategy, and we wanted to go out of the border, and it was very clear from the very beginning for us. So export to French-speaking Africa and investing in local manufacturing so that we can develop regional integration. So in these markets, in sub-Saharan French Africa, but not only, local production is less than 5%, including North Africa and South Africa, where we have an imported coverage of production. So in most of the countries, you do not have even one plant for manufacturing pharmaceuticals. And on the other hand, we do import in these countries products, and these products in some countries are either counterfeited, 60% or 50% are counterfeited product or low quality products. Low quality because they go through distribution channels which do not guarantee good storage conditions. And when the products are imported through the right or through the proper channels, they are far too expensive or available in small quantities. And you also have these aids given to governments, which I believe will move to dedicated needs, and then we'll have this crucial demand for pharmaceuticals. We also have, unfortunately, raising bad lifestyle habits also in our regions, so which will cause diseases that will need also to be addressed. So what do we have? We have from one hand no products, no production, and on the other hand harmful or non-available products. So here I believe that local manufacturing is not an option, it is really necessary. So that's why we started thinking about how to invest in these countries, and we were looking at ways of doing it. So we had the opportunity to invest in Cameroon. One company was shut down, and we decided to go there. It wasn't easy, and I must say that the way we've done it is that we've managed to have very few people from Tunisia in Cameroon, so that we have focused on training and coaching local teams so that they really own the processes. So that's what happens. We relied also on our partner banks in Tunisia for local banking in Cameroon because we were just perfect strangers. And unfortunately, when you have to deal with bureaucracy with long delays for certificates, with long delays for authorization, which is something needed in our sector, you very quickly face cash issues or working capital problems. So that was important. We also managed to keep the former owner in our capital, so that we keep a kind of understanding of the local culture. We also spent a long time understanding the market, because when you come to pharmaceuticals, no country looks like the other country, and sometimes it can be really very specific. I believe that local manufacturing is very difficult. Local manufacturing of pharmaceuticals is difficult. It's becoming harder and harder, even for countries where you have this tradition of manufacturing. So that's why I believe it wasn't done. And I believe that countries like ours, at least those countries which developed some local manufacturing, might be the right players in the southern region, I would say, because the business of pharmaceutical is not that big for multinationals. It's not even interesting. So it's so fragmented that it's not interesting. So, of course, there were some issues and mainly delays, but it's delays and financials overall. So that's what I would say about our experience in Cameroon.
Thank you very much. Basil Baz, very different sector. Please tell us about Carbon Holdings and about what you're doing to industrialize Africa.
No, absolutely, and I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to begin. I mean, I think one of the things I enjoyed the most was being on a flight for about 9 hours and being in the same time zone. And so it's completely thrown me off. I think I have more jet lag from this trip than from when I go to the United States or go to Asia. But I want to address two things, if I may. I want to address what we're doing as a continent for Africa, not as Carbon Holdings, but just in general terms, and where we see things need to be looked at, things need to be focused on. And I'm also going to talk about what we're doing and how we see it. Now, when we look at the continent, and we look at the initiatives by various African organizations, there is a key element that we all talk about, which is employment. And this, to a certain extent, is the Achilles heel that we have. We need to find a way to employ 500 million people quickly. And this is where there's a disconnect. And it's not going to happen through IT or advanced technologies. It's going to occur when we execute basic industries. Because there are a series of steps that any industrialized economy must take in order to move and become a service-oriented economy. And one of the nice charts that I saw was the one saying, where are the powerhouses trading within Africa? And South Africa had a tremendous list. And this is on the back of Sasol, a major petrochemical producer. Because the reality is, industry does not develop without petrochemical products. The German economy after World War II was built on the back of the petrochemical sector. The Korean economy was built following the opening of the first cracker facility in Ulsan in 1972, and the government quickly realized that it's only through petrochemicals that they can industrialize, and they built 11 more. The British economy went from a steel industrial state to a petrochemical oil and gas state, and the last cracker in the United Kingdom closed in 1990, which nobody realizes. They were a heavyweight in the oil and gas sector. The entire US manufacturing sector was based on the US Gulf Coast oil and gas industry that was there. Everything you see around us here, with the exception of what's wood, glass, and metal, is made from petchem, whether it's synthetics, rubbers, fibers. If you look at building materials, if you don't have domestically manufactured petrochemicals for your building materials, guess what? You're going to import all of them. If you start executing an industrial program and you don't produce the raw material, you're going to end up importing like it's nobody's business. And so what we're looking to do is effectively put in place what I would call the first major integrated petrochemical facility in Egypt. And not just in Egypt, in Africa, given the size that we are doing so. And I'd like to thank my colleague from the United Kingdom on the panel, because we are in receipt of a US dollar 1.8 billion loan guarantee from UK Export Finance. And the reality is, these transactions can only be done with long-term, low-cost export credit debt. It doesn't work any other way. We've put in place today $5.4 billion of 17-year debt supported by export credit debt. It doesn't work any other way. We've put in place today $5.4 billion of 17-year debt supported by UK Export Finance with $1.8 billion, Euler Hermes of Germany for $2.8 billion, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation with a $400 million direct loan, and Export Development Canada with a $400 million direct loan. We've taken the guarantees to market. We were tremendously oversubscribed, which tells you of the appetite of the Western European and North American commercial banks for something like this, effectively booking the UKEF facility, which was significantly oversubscribed, and the German facility, which was subscribed to by a club of German banks. But looking at an interest rate of 1.15% and 1.2% respectively, which then feeds into your ability to survive and your ability to maintain a minimum debt service coverage ratio above 2. And this is what you look at. Now, what are we going to do off the bat? We are going to create 30,000 jobs during the construction period. We're going to employ 3,000 engineers and technicians. But we are going to produce products that we expect 200,000 jobs will be created in less than a decade as a consequence of these products staying in country. And if companies start trading these products with other companies, the expectation that 1 million jobs will be created. There is a very famous case study of the cracker in Nigeria, that when it was operational, there were about 200,000 jobs indirect around it and about 400 companies. When the cracker shut down, the companies went bankrupt within 24 months, the jobs were lost. The facility was auctioned, Indorama acquired it, restarted it. Within 3 years, 250,000 jobs reappeared in the surrounding region. And the statistics support this from a per capita income point of view, from a per capita GDP point of view, from a trade balance point of view. And so, when looking at the holistic view of Africa, you must first take care of your own house. There are some very basic things. You need to produce power, you need to have highways, you need to be able to move products within the country. The second thing you have to do is you have to look at these basic industries to start employing people, because we have, and I'm just roughly translating it, and this is the problem. Tell me who your parents are, and I will predict your future with 99% accuracy. This is why the best on the continent are leaving, because no matter what they do, the opportunities are not there. The second problem that we have is women's rights. And this is an extremely serious issue. You are talking about 50% of your consumer market, 50% of your labor force, and from what we see in Egypt, the woman runs the house. Make no mistake. And I encourage any man in here to tell me otherwise. But yet, you take a look at women's rights issues, they're not there. You take a look at manufacturing opportunities or employment opportunities, not there. You cannot get into this fight with one of your arms tied behind your back. The solution is not one thing. It's not a program. It is a combination of elements that will ultimately create a holistic environment in which we will be able to industrialize. And let me just give you one simple thing. The mining sector in Africa, fantastic industry, we all know it. In order to mine, you need a product called low-density ammonium nitrate. Africa produces none. South Africa is balanced for their own consumption. All of this product is imported from Germany, from Sweden, from Australia, from the Philippines. And so in theory, if we decided we wanted to do the mining ourselves on the continent, we can't, because we don't have the basic material needed for this. There are certain steps that we have to take. Look at Korea, look at the US, look at Germany, look at the UK. We don't need to develop something new. We can look at their models, see what they did, and we'll find it's pretty straightforward. But there needs to be a will.
Thank you very much. So I see time is running, but I'd like to ask Ibrahim Ayaki one question. Tunis, Joburg, no direct flight, was that the situation? So what will it take for better air connectivity in Africa? And the reason I asked this in an industrialization session is part of our strategy it's a second pillar, is also to support, to develop the supporting infrastructure that will enable industrialization. So if you could say a word about that, and then I'll open it up to Q&A to the audience.
Thank you, Ghislaine. We have frameworks. You know, the Yamoussoukro decision on opening the skies, the latest single African air transport market. The frameworks are quite comprehensive of the technical solutions. What I always keep repeating is that most of the technical solutions to whatever development problem have been known, condensed, analyzed, accumulated. The issue is not about finding new technical solutions. Evidently, innovation can lead to better technical solutions. But no technical solutions can work if it does not have a political solution combined to it. So, regarding the single air transport market, we have currently a political will, and we need to go very fast. 50% of the African airports will be out of standards in the next 5 years, according to ICAO. So that's a huge challenge that we need to face. So I'm just giving one example because we don't have time. What is needed is acceleration. And the key to acceleration goes beyond the technical solution. It lies in the political solution. And if we decide with the necessary political determination to open the skies, it can happen very quickly. Acceleration is the key word.
Thank you. So, and that connects very well with what we found in analyzing the recent trends in industrial development in Africa. The countries that have seen the fastest growth are the countries that had the clearest political will to support industrialization. And these are countries, you know, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Morocco, Egypt. South Africa has been among those as well, although they start from a higher base. So this combination of the technical will, the private sector willingness to invest and to commit, but with strong political will, with stability, with medium-term outlooks that enable investors to take risks is something that is true for air transport, but also true for the industrialization agenda more generally. I open the floor now to questions. We'll take a few questions. If there's someone with microphones, there's a question there. Do we have some other questions? We start with that one. Okay.
Just a comment, two quick comments. Thank you very much, Elbaz.
Please briefly introduce yourself, Prof.
My name is Banji Oyeyinka. I work with ADB now. I really enjoyed your comments, and I was a bit afraid in the beginning that the discussion was going to go on without the historical perspective. Many people don't remember that 50 years ago, most African countries actually adopted import substitution industrialization. By the time we got to the end of the 70s and mid-80s, we had structural adjustment. Nigeria, for example, 1971, established an authority to produce steel, iron and steel. We spent over $6 billion at that time. We had an aluminum company. We had fertilizer companies, like 5 of them. We had sugar companies. There is none of them functioning today. So before we move on to this next phase, which I enjoy very much in terms of involving private sector, we need to ask ourselves, why did these nations fail? The same thing happened to Kenya. Kenya had an industrial policy in 1963. All of them, same stories, Tanzania, Malawi, all of them. So that's the first point, and this is really the point all of them knew that they needed both iron and steel and metallic industries, as well as petrochemical industries, to ensure that they can industrialize. All of them failed. Second point, there's no time to go into these stories. Second point I need to make is about today. The graphs that Abdul showed, for example. If you look at what has happened to Africa in the last 20, 25 years, what has happened is that the services sector is now making the biggest contribution to overall GDP. Even in countries that, smaller countries in terms of GDP, Ethiopia, Rwanda, 58%, 60%. In terms of services, Nigeria, 50%. Industry, less than 23%, less than 22%. If you take out manufacturing out of industry, some of them are less than 10%. As he said, services would never solve the structural unemployment problem. Unless you industrialize, services can never solve it. We have actually jumped the manufacturing phase. This is the problem Africa is going through. We are able to analyze 25 years of data, and we found almost all the countries jumped the manufacturing phase.
Can you conclude, please?
Yes, please, it's very important. Because before we move on to profiling new solutions, we need to understand why we failed in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Yes, over there. Microphone, please.
Thank you. Since Al-Bazar has spoken about women's rights, I thought let me just stand up and ask a question. One of the key, my name is Pele Sankomo, I'm the economic advisor in Gauteng. One of the key issues I would really be interested to hear, and I didn't hear from any of the speakers, it's around whether should African governments develop an incentive programs to support industrialization. I think the earlier speaker makes the point around import substitution, which I would assume that the basis for it would have been an incentive program, and particularly to support young engineers and also to support research and development. I mean, I think it's a well-known fact, the need for job creation and ensuring that we support young people to have employment opportunities. And without the incentive programs, do you think that we're going to be able to industrialize the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. Another question over there.
Hello. My name is Moses Akwa, representing Young Innovators, and I just want to buttress on what she just said. I think that as much as we are talking about industrialization, we've heard over and over again countries like Germany, countries like the USA, how they've been able to get there. But I keep asking myself the question, are we always learning from that, and are we changing our ways? If you look at the way Germany has been supported by the SMEs, the question is, what do we do with our SMEs in this current state? Are we making sure that the SMEs are helping in building this whole industrial revolution, or are we taking them out and asking for foreign investors to come in and put them aside? So my question is, how are we actually building this whole economy with the SME and the young people?
Fantastic. Can we...
let me just take, we only have one round, so if you don't mind, I'll take a last question and then I'll give the panelists an opportunity to respond. You have a last question? Yes, in the back there.
Yes, my question piggybacks on that young man's. We've heard, I'm Flory Lazier from the Corporate Council on Africa and used to manage the AGOA program in the US. And we were always disappointed that we did not have more value-added products coming to the US duty-free under AGOA. Even the apparel, Bangladesh by itself produces 7 times as much as all of sub-Saharan Africa combined. But I wanted to ask a question about whether or not the industrialization policies will have to be tailored and different. This gentleman was saying you know, maybe we could look at US and Germany and how others have done it because there's some basics to it. But I'm wondering, since Africa's services sector has already sort of outstripped and there's this gap in industrialization and manufacturing, what can we do to go back and help Africa to capture a larger share of global manufacturing? Do we do it the same as China and South Korea, US, Germany, or do we do it differently?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. So, as you can see here, panelists, our time is running out. So what I will do is ask you all to be brief, and you pick whatever question you want to respond to, or anything else you want to say as a concluding remark, and please, 1 minute or less. Okay, I'll start with you.
All right, so what I'm going to try and do is just basically hit all 4 questions in a minute.
Okay.
So the one thing I'd like you to do on the chart for the presentation is I'd like you to overlay unemployment growth in the same period and immigration of Africans to foreign countries. And what you'll find is you will be blown away. And that is the root of the problem. Looking at one of the ways we've looked to industrialize, it's through import substitution. The problem that you have there is you put up the barriers, you wait for your local economy and your local manufacturers to flourish, and they don't. And you end up putting yourself in a position where you're importing a car in a box, you're assembling it in country, and you effectively become a Lego manufacturer, and the spread is called the customs arbitrage. Now you can't take the barrier down because the car factory is going to have unemployment, and you get yourself into a mess. In terms of looking at Germany, I disagree. Let's not look at Germany. Let's look at South Korea following the armistice. 70% unemployment, 50% illiteracy. Taking aid packages from the Philippines to pay the civil servants. They built one naphtha cracker, producing weird products called polyethylene and polypropylene. But then this small Korean SME went up, rang the doorbell, said, "Can I buy some polyethylene?" That was a company called Samsung. They wanted to try to injection mold something. A second one called LG showed up, called Lucky Gold Star at that time. A third one called SK went up. Your SMEs will never work without basic materials to convert.
Thank you. Sarah, any question and or concluding remarks?
Yeah. I mean, what I notice is the question is all the way around about how to industrialize, not why. Why, it's obvious. We know that we need that. How to industrialize. So are we going to take a German model? Are we taking I don't know what? So what I think is that we have, in each country, have to set what I love to call a public-private dialogue. We've gone through this in Tunisia for our sector, and that it proved that we could make reforms. So I think that if we have public-private sector, and it could be young people, it can be women, I don't really like to make this, well, this is my opinion. But I would like this to be organized in each country, and I believe that institutions can really manage to have these discussions. I saw that in one of the presentations. It was one of the first maybe priorities set by the ADB. So I believe if we can make it without trying to set models or that cannot really fit with the countries.
Thank you very much. Jeffrey.
Thanks. My remarks will largely be because of the experience in South Africa. I think incentives do play a role. If you look at what the Department of Trade and Industry does, we have an APD program, which is very successful. It helps manufacturing. On the textiles, we have the CTC program, which helps modernize, and it works. And it also talks to supplying, particularly on the garments, on the textiles. Partnered with that, the DTI is also supporting on SME. But the point on why have we leapfrogged and gone into services is because we have not invested, at least in my opinion, as much on the infrastructure. That asks of us to take a long-term view, that asks of us for the financiers to come into the party and also be prepared to take the risk, because once you invest in the infrastructure, then you'll be able to unlock all types of infrastructure, energy, roads, rails, and all of that. And I think we can be able to go back. We've got the resources. In terms of agriculture, we've got the land. And indeed, we'll have the opportunity to make sure that we do create those jobs that we're supposed to do.
Thank you. Emma.
So perhaps a really obvious point to make. Business does business, but I think there's a really important role for governments to play in terms of creating the right industrialization strategies and incentive programs that help to drive the right behaviors and the right focus within economies. We've seen that time and time again. I think you can't, one shouldn't just simply cut and paste an industrialization strategy that made sense in a particular economy at a particular time. I think the right industrialization strategy will differ, and as we've seen, the fragmented African continent, makes no sense to have exactly the same focus. So it has to be a sensible, prioritized industrialization strategy with the incentives of tax to support the right research and development, to support investment into the right sectors.
Thank you. Ibrahim.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. The biggest challenge we have is the creation of jobs for these 400 million cohorts of young in the next 20 roughly years. So we can't do without labor-intensive industries. If we don't have labor-intensive industries, we won't be able to create these jobs. All our government's systems will fail because of insecurity, chaos, etc. Point number two, we need to look at our internal markets. That's where we will learn to be competitive. And innovation is already boosting. Giving priority to our regional markets is the way to go. Lastly, the Central Communist, the Communist Central Party of China is not composed of businessmen, but they understand what business is. Thank you.
Thank you. And they compete with each other. So, absolutely. So, look, great session. Thanks a lot to the panelists. Maybe a few words from me to conclude. Industrialize Africa is one of our high fives. It's a priority. We are an important player at the African Development Bank, but we're only one of many, and we'll only succeed together with you, together with our partners here that came together around the Africa Investment Forum. So we are both lending to private companies, and we're particularly keen to lend to companies, African companies, but also international ones that are expanding outside of their home market. That is definitely one of our priorities. We are keen to help companies that also help us integrate Africa by creating supply chains and linkages, and by getting policymakers to move on and develop more business-friendly and more open policies. But so we are at the same time a lender to private companies. Sometimes through private equity investors, we also invest in equity, but we also advisors to government and lenders to government. About 2/3 of our lending is to governments, and we're advisors to governments too. So to give the right advice to government, we need input from private sector. We need inputs from bankers and from financiers, from those who are doing the deals and who are trying to make the deals. If we'd had more time, I had other questions that were ready for the panel, but we don't have that time. And two of my questions were really, what can we as development financiers, and not just the African Development Bank, but also IDC, DBSA, Africa 50, Afrexim Bank, or Trade and Development Bank, the sponsors today, or all the other development partners, financiers that are active on the continent, how can we make a difference in this acceleration that is needed in industrialization? And as several of the panelists have emphasized, while industrialization is not the panacea, it's a critical dimension of providing employment for Africa's youth. It's one of the critical elements. So how can we help development financiers, but also how can we help governments in adopting the right policies? How can we help regional economic commissions in coming up with the policies that will encourage the member countries to develop larger markets? Because as several of you have emphasized, and as the study made clear as well, Africa's markets are too fragmented. If you want to invest in particular investment that is catered to the domestic market, you need to have access to larger markets. So I'd like this to be an invitation to continue to the dialogue. Abdul Mukhtar, who presented the study before, is our director both for industrial and trade development, so which shows how we see the two as an integral part. We are a partnership organization, and so we're keen to continue this dialogue, to work with all of you and with others in finding ways to accelerate industrialization, not just in general, but also through specific investment opportunities and specific support to governments that, like some of the other governments that I mentioned earlier in an earlier intervention, are willing to go to set medium-term targets, to stick to them, and to provide that predictable environment that will encourage more investors to come and put their capital at risk to help industrialize Africa and help with our overall economic development. Thank you so much for staying so late, and I wish you a very good evening and also a happy ending to the Africa Investment Forum. Thank you all very much for your participation. Oh,